What's up, everyone? So now we're going to look at chapter four as we continue to build our base and understanding sort of the global system. Uh, and in another week or so, we'll get into looking at regions of the world and we'll explore them more directly. And then we'll get into some of the issues. Uh, but again, this is all built around developing a base of understanding. And of course, if this were a semester long course, we would have much more time. But since it's a condensed course, we understand that there's going to be fewer things we'll be looking at, but it's still important for you to build this base to go forward in case you decide you want to pursue the major or pursue work in international relations or comparative politics or something like that. This is really important that you understand the context of how the world works and maybe look at it through ways that maybe you didn't look at it in the past. So hopefully this provides some of that for you. Uh, so now we're going to look at the money. And when I talk about the money, I'm talking about economics, that we have to be able to sort of assess how the world works, and what drives a lot of how the world works is all based on money. And of course, when we talk about money in the context of a global world, we're talking about things like international development, how money operates, the various entities that control money, like the World Bank or the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, uh, and how the global wealthier countries control the global poor countries. Sometimes you hear them called the global north, meaning the wealthier countries, and the global south, meaning the poorer countries on the planet. Uh, but it's ironic that most of the resources reside in the poorer regions, but the exploiters of those resources that control them reside in the northern regions, which have fewer resources. So it's sort of an interesting dichotomy, if you would, that the people who actually have the resources don't really control their own resources. They're controlled by outside entities. But let's talk about this a little bit in understanding sort of in the context of why money is so important, and also understanding that what happens globally if one country collapses, why it affects the rest of the world. And my analogy that I like to use in looking at this is the Titanic. Of course, the great ocean liner that sunk over 100 years ago when it hit an iceberg driving too fast and with a small rudder and couldn't steer away at the last minute. So a lot of bad things can happen in a very short period of time if you're not so lucky. But imagine, the United States being the Titanic, and then all the other countries being the little dinghies, the little small boats, the lifeboats on the side that are connected to the Titanic. And then once the Titanic goes down, all the little dinghies on the side of the boat go down, right? So everybody drowns. So most of the global systems are controlled and through the global north, the wealthier countries, and they have alliances with one another that they cooperate and they trade with each other's currency. They buy each other's bonds, the mechanisms that drive their economies. We all borrow from each other and things like this. And it keeps everybody interconnected. So they all absorb each other's debt. They absorb the wealth of it all. But the other side of that is if something goes wrong, they also absorb the disaster. But the disaster hits in different kinds of fashions around the world. So, for example, when uh, when the 2008 global economic crisis hit in the United States, and I'll talk about that in a little more detail here in a second, which what might have been an earthquake 5.0 or 6.0 in the United States, in some parts of the world was a 10.0 or even or worse, because if our economy collapses and a lot of other countries depend on us, we can unhinge whole governments and create complete instability in other countries because they are relying on us to be able to sustain themselves. And in poor countries that are used to, where they're relying on the United States to give them money to feed their people, when people are starving, they'll overthrow the government and find somebody who will give them something to live on. So it's important to understand that context of how important it is to maintain some economic stability. And also, I would say, uh, on a positive side of this, because money runs the global system, and everybody wants to make money. The wealthy countries, China, Russia, United States, the major players all want to make money. It is rare the concept of even considering going to direct warfare anymore because nobody wants to destabilize the global system. They want to keep the money flowing. And anything that's an impediment to the flow of money and wealth, no one wants to deal with. And since all these countries are out for money, then the idea of trying to create something that's going to cause warfare that costs money, and wars are very expensive, they'd rather be able to make money than spend money. So there's a simple reason, strangely enough, why in the modern context, modern countries don't go to war with one another directly. Yeah, there's cyber warfare. We deal with that all the time with Russia and China and North Korea and the different things like that. But that's a different kind of war front and war game than the traditional, line up the tanks and point guns at each other. So there is some value to not shooting at each other, but the consequences of their economic realities certainly does bode and impact the rest of the world around them. Um, so let's give you a quick understanding of this in terms of the global crisis sense. So back in 2008, when the United States hit a global wall, economically speaking, it was the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s, starting with the collapse of the stock market in 1929. But throughout the 1930s, when America really almost unhinged itself and almost had its democracy come to an end. Uh, and a lot of this in the 2008 crisis was derived because of the decline in banking liquidity. The housing market burst in 2007, and the blowback or result of that led to this economic crisis. Unfortunately, we had put a lot of, instead of our economic base being based on manufacturing and technology and innovation, the government has started to put all their money and eggs into the housing basket. And when the housing basket burst, it really brought down the economy. It's also driven by the banking deregulations that started in the 1980s that allowed for this what we call free market or laissez-faire economy to go rampant. And I'll give you an analogy of that. That's like us paying our taxes, and the government collects our taxes and then takes our tax money and go to Vegas and bets it on, puts it on the crap table, and then somebody rolls the dice and then they lose their money in one fell swoop, and that big stick comes out and just takes all the money away, right? That's kind of analogous to what really took place in this economic crisis. Uh, but the results of that crisis didn't just affect Americans, and we are still recovering from that crisis even to this day, 13 years later. Uh, but it affected the entire world. I mean, it wasn't just us. If we can't afford to go and buy and spend around the world to generate revenue for other countries, then we unhinge them as well. And so it becomes what we call a cascade effect, where everyone is affected by the results of what happened here. This also took place in the mid 1990s when the Asian crisis happened. I think it was 1997. And again, when the Asian crisis happened, the tsunami effect around the world was tremendous because everyone was tied to the Asian financial markets. So, this is why it's also incredibly important. Another example would be in Europe. When Europe had its debt crisis a few years ago, actually a little more than a few years ago now, probably almost 10 years ago now, and basically they had to buy out the debt to support the bank bailouts in Greece and Ireland and Portugal, and I think even Spain was affected. So most of Europe was affected by the debt crisis which was a result of a recession that took place in Europe. When we talk about recession, we're talking about two different aspects of the idea of the recession. One is, of course, a decline in economic growth, and then the other one is this idea of you have a period of high unemployment with escalating federal debt, and those things can also create massive problems in terms of recession. Uh, and if, ironically, even though Greece got a bailout, it didn't solve their problem. In fact, the problem resurfaced again because they kept refinancing the public debt in Greece to try and get. So in other words, you can't buy your way out of a problem always. You got to be able to solve the infrastructure problem, and were not able to do that at that time. Um, and some of that derives from a lot of other aspects too. So lots of things that are intertwined with this regarding the economy. There are also some other countries that have had impacts as well. Latin America, they've had their issues with debt, certainly due to during the economic reform, during the debt crisis, the 1980s and 1990s, and they recovered pretty well, even though more recently they've had a tremendous economic issue and downturn in the last 4 or 5 years. But they weathered the early debt crises pretty well. China also did pretty well. They didn't go in like China, South Korea, India did pretty well, managed through the recession period and debt crises. Some of the poorer countries, though, in Southeast Asia really took a hit. So it varied from country to country. And the Middle East did, basically because of the oil, was able to weather the storm of the debt crises during this period of time. But it does illustrate how important it is to understand just how much damage can be done with each of us sort of being reliant on each other's economies to be successful, particularly, as I said, in the global north, the wealthier countries. But this leads us to a lot of questions that need to be sort of looked at, right? One of the questions, how do social scientists describe and understand what happened to the world trade and finance in the years leading up to the downturn? So you have to be able to look at the historical or empirical evidence and say, how do we get there, and how do we make sure we don't get there again, right? So what drove us off the cliff, and how do we make sure we don't get driven off the cliff again? Ironically, some of the same practices that got us pushed off the cliff, we're still practicing today. So it's amazing how people sometimes can't learn from their mistakes. I think some of the other questions could be, how do the governments decide what policies to enact, or to help lessen the effect of a crisis? So how do you go about trying to reverse the effects of a crisis? Or how do we measure whether or not those policies are even effective? So even after you've implemented the policies, how do you effectively have a check and balance to see if they actually have done what they say they're going to do? So all these things play into the ideas of understanding that we need to be able to ascertain to make sure that the global markets continue free of encumberment, right? So now just some basic understanding of economics. And I don't expect you to be an economic expert, but just to give you some basic understanding of economics and how it works. So when we talk about the definition of economics, we're really talking about, in the context of social science, it's talking about the studies and models and descriptions that make projections about the production, the distribution, the consumption of goods and services around the world. So who makes them, who distributes them, and who consumes them, okay? And some of the leading assumptions about this are that, one, people have unlimited desires. We as people, we want what we want. And yet the second assumption is that people have limited resources. So I might want that Lamborghini, but I might not be able to afford that Lamborghini. People evaluate their actions according to cost and benefit, right? So if it's, in terms of my actions, is it worth me doing this? What's the cost benefit of me doing this? And then lastly, people are basically selfish and self-interested. So it's about me and what I want, as opposed to about making sure that the common good of society or that the economic ability of our country or people is protected. So it's about so it's basically saying, well, as long as I'm good, I'm not worried about anybody else being good. And that's a pretty dangerous place to be. Now, under the umbrella of economics, there are multiple different types of economics. Primarily, the first one we'll talk about is what we call liberal economics. And this basically is the idea of understanding of what free markets are. And I called it laissez-faire economics. And basically the assumption is that free markets will provide a society with maximum benefits. So you let the market do what it does, and it does its best when it has very little government intervention. You let it go off on its own, let it go through its highs and its lows, its ups and its downs, and the government will make great return on its investment if you just let corporate America run it, do what it does without any government interference. These are some of the basic principles of what we call liberal economics. The notion that people sort of they want to gain the maximum possible benefit at the least possible cost. That's the essence of liberal economics. We have a couple of terms here that I want to share with you in regards to this issue. One is the issue of scarcity, and this basically denotes that humans have an unlimited demand or have unlimited demands, but have limited resources. That's called what we call scarcity. And then opportunity cost is basically the value of the demands that are not met. So again, we're talking about the cost benefit analysis, the opportunity cost of doing business and what that means in terms of the cost benefit. And then when we talk about marginal utility, we're talking about, what is the goal of business? And, or I should say the goal of business, of course, is to increase and become successful. And at some point, the question is, when is the consumer's satisfaction gained? So their goal, so that what they want to do is try to increase our satisfaction by increasing their marginal utility. Because if we're happy, we're buying their products, they're making money, everybody wins. And then the last thing has to do with supply and demand. A lot of times when you make demand high, you can drive the prices up, right? Even if you could have, for example, let's say they have a new iPhone that comes out, which it is sometime in September, the iPhone 13. And if Apple wanted to drive the price up, they can make a bazillion of them and have them stocked in a warehouse, but only trickle them out a little bit at a time. And you know what happens? Everybody wants it, right? So the prices can be popped up because they don't have so many on the market yet. Now imagine if they had saturated the market and had all these iPhone 13s out there, then they wouldn't be able to maybe support the price that it may cost when it comes out publicly. So the idea of decreasing supply will increase demand, which means you can increase your price. Make sense? Yep, that's how it works. When we talk about things like, again, getting to more the theoretical aspects of economics, like economic nationalism, and these are basically talks about the economic policies and how they're guided by the need to protect labor conditions or production of goods and wealth accumulation within the nation itself, right, or within the country itself. So this is like when we talk about it in the economics in the global sense and how countries maximize or protect their wealth or accumulation of their own countries. And basically the assumptions here are that, the well-being of a nation depends on its control of capital, of how it controls its money. Or are they in control of their money? Most countries want to be in control of their own economic reality. The truth is, only a handful of countries control their own economic viability. The rest are controlled by the global north, those probably anywhere from 6 to 10 countries in the planet that control most of the resources and economics of the world. So it's interesting how most countries are not in a position to protect themselves or thrive, or even get a seat at what I call the diplomatic table, without having a strong economy or some ability to have something to offer to drive themselves or drive their wealth accumulation. Also, the economy is not independent of a country's social and political system. So when you talk about money, you have to talk about it in terms of the connection between politics and the social system, and you cannot divest money from that, even though the problem in that is that capitalism is driven by money, but it's not driven by any sort of ethical or moral guidance. So there's no moral compass in capitalism. It's all about maximization of wealth. So it doesn't care about who wins or who loses or who starves to death and who doesn't. It's about how much can I maximize and how much do I have to spend my workers to do what I want them to do. And then another part of that, and the last part of the issue regarding economic nationalism, focuses on the goal of the mercantilist. And really they're talking about the mercantilists are focused on primarily the enforcement of protectionist policies like tariffs and subsidies and import quotas. That's kind of what the focus of the mercantilist is, and in terms of what they want to accomplish under the auspices of this economic nationalist ideology. So then the next thing we focus on, driving into this idea of how economics works and the workers themselves, is Marxism. Now, Karl Marx is an interesting guy, very interesting man, a very difficult man who lived in the mid 19th century. Wrote many famous books like Das Kapital and lots of other writings on economics and on Marxist theory. It's funny, he gets blamed for a lot of things, even though he's just a guy who had a theory about economics and what would happen when the exploitation of workers got out of hand. So he gets blamed for a lot of stuff that really had nothing to do with him. I've often wondered, if Marx had the ability to live another 150 years, what he would think about the world we live in today, and what if his original theories would he assess today, or what would he have modified from his original view about how he saw the world and workers in the world. Um, so the very premise of Marxism basically was that the value of goods is based not on what the consumers will pay, but on the cost of labor required to produce it. So basically, the labor is what drives the value. Um, and he and Friedrich Engels wrote, in fact, there's a very famous book, The Marx Engels Reader, and it's a very thick, dense volume, discusses this in greater detail. But basically, they argue that the struggles between the class of owners and the class of workers was the driving force behind historical change. And he called them the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So the bourgeoisie would be the owners of businesses, and the workers would be the proletariat. So those are the two entities that he was discussing in his context. And when he talked about the two economic classes, again, he said those who laborers create the wealth, and those were the workers of the proletariat, and those who own the means of production or own the businesses, the land, the factories, the resources, those he called the bourgeoisie. Uh, and so understanding his view of the world, which he derives in the mid 19th to late 19th, well, to the later 19th century, by the early 20th century, when Vladimir Lenin comes into fruition, he takes Marx's ideology and creates his own version of it that leads to these what we call totalitarian or authoritarian systems. They're basically under the context of economics are what we call command economics, in which basically the state controls all aspects of society, and their goal is to meet the needs of the people, and they assign the production tasks to all the individuals, the workers, but that basically the state controls every aspect of the economic viability of the people within their countries. And this is one of the aspects of contemporary or modern Marxism. The other one is what we call social democracy. Now, this is what you see mostly in a lot of in fact, almost every other progressive modern Western democracy operates as a social democracy, meaning that you have a balance between people and money. And this is really an important concept because with capitalism, which says money here, people here, right? You've got this difference where money is more important than people. And then you have this other issue with social democracy. Even though they have capitalism, it tries to bring closer into balance the relationship between people and money. It still says money is probably more important than people, but there are social contexts that they have to deal with that keeps it closer so that the policies that are enacted are there to still protect the people. So if you look at Western Europe as usually our model for social democracies, also Japan and other parts of the world as well meaning that they have a strong relationship to their people and protection of their people, economic protection of their people through their economic system. So in the social democracies, the states play a role in the ownership of production within the market societies to ensure that all citizens' needs are met. So they have lots of subsidies. If you're poor in Sweden, you don't have to go live in squalor. You'll be protected. You'll have keep a good apartment, and you will not have to starve to death or live in squalor if you're poor. It's not even looked down upon if you lose a job or something like that. There are protections in place for you. Both public and private partnerships are in place. You have state-owned businesses that are in competition with private entities. There's a lot of privatization now, like in England. One of the smartest things they did under Margaret Thatcher, for all the criticism she got, was she privatized the railroads. And with that, it became a money-making institution instead of a heavily government bureaucracy that was way behind in everything. It was amazing how much it transformed the economy and also transformed England in terms of their viability, economically speaking. Now, in terms of understanding the general idea of economics, there are two primary views, the big picture and small picture. The small picture is what we call microeconomics. And microeconomics looks at specific market systems on a very small scale. It assumes that a host of buyers and sellers, none of whom can control the market or price, but exist in place to be able to drive the economic system. So their premise is, again, that everybody's out there and they all want a piece of the pie, right? The macro view, or macroeconomics as it's called, combines performance of all markets in a defined market system. So it wants to see how all the markets are performing at a bigger scale. Uh, it's also driven by what we call GDP, or the gross domestic product, which is the primary indicator of the performance in a macro system. So how much money does the United States have? What is it? In other words, once we spend and what we bring in, right? At the end of the day, when you look at what we spend versus what we make, that what you make with the balance there is what you call your GDP. That's your gross domestic product. How much do you have left in your bank book at the end of the month, right? That's what the GDP is. There's also development economics, which is another aspect which focuses on basically growth strategies in poorer countries, and basically, the idea of how to help them develop themselves, how to grow their economies through development of economic infrastructure. Uh, there are many unexpected local consequences with development, because sometimes you have to give up a lot of what you want personally in order to have the wealthier countries come in to your poor country to try to, and then be able to drive your economy or drive it the way they want instead of the way that you may want, right? So, for example, if you look at the United States and Mexico, Mexico doesn't have any money without the United States. The U.S. Federal Reserve basically controls Mexico's money. So the peso is backed by the U.S. Federal Reserve. So Mexico doesn't have any money without the United States. So the idea of the subtle, nuanced control of what happens in Mexico, and not just from the economic side, but even from the political side, is easily manipulated and controlled by the United States. So that's how we were able to do what we were able to do there. And then the last couple of things just I want to touch on here, obviously the idea of globalization, which really has a lot to do with the expanding of global communication, expansion of global markets and connections across various global entities, the growth of social and political interdependence, development of planetary awareness of these various systems, so we can understand how things got to be where they are, and understand our roles and responsibilities and places in creating this global community that is based on all these different entities, whether it be cultural or economics, all these different aspects. And then the neoliberalist idea of this is sort of an adaptation of liberal economic theory, but applied to the world economy. So under neoliberalism, or a neoliberalist economy, the basic tenets are ease of restriction on trade between countries, the free movement of goods and services between countries, the maximization of economic efficiency and profits, open trade and privatization of government positions. This is how the wealthier countries are able to control and manipulate the smaller countries, by trying to incorporate or enact policies or various trade organizations or entities like the WTO, or various treaties like GATT, and the various things that they have put in place to be able to protect or ensure their own economic vitality, even if it ends up ultimately hurting the poorer countries in the process. So with that, the understanding of that these international economics, the understanding that study of the trade of financial relations of the national economies and the effects on international trade and finance on the distribution of production and income and wealth around the world within nations, are all aspects of what we call international economics. Of course, the WTO, as I said, has been, in some ways, they've been praised for their part in, breaking down the trade barriers. But here's the other side of that. The other side of that is that everything that they have tried to vote down safety regulations across the globe that they consider to be an impediment to trade. So even if it was going to cause workers harm, they were voting down things that protected the workers. So it has been they have been a jack of all trades, but a Jekyll-Hyde relationship between rich countries and poor countries. let's see. So the idea of sustainability. When we talk about sustainability, we're really talking about the idea of how to meet the present needs without jeopardizing the needs of future generations. So how do we make sure we don't screw over our children's children, right? And that comes from obviously having an awareness of our history, making sure that looking at the past to make sure we don't repeat that going forward. Uh, Make sure you're understanding the context of resource sustainability so that we don't burn up all the resources. And I don't mean burn literally, but like, for example, the amount of potable water on the planet has diminished significantly over the last 50 years. So how do we make sure that people have water resource? How do we make sure there's good abundant food resource? How do we make sure that we leave the planet better than we found it for the next generations? And of course, that deals with all types of things that deal with the ecological things, uh, both focusing on climate change and things like that. Um, so there's a lot more detail in there, but again, I don't need you to be an economic expert. Just want you to have a basis of understanding kind of how the world works, generally speaking. And I'll leave it at that. And that's it for chapter 4. And I will see you next time for chapter 5. You guys have a great one. See you.